The shovel hit something hard. Not rock, not clay, not the stubborn caliche crust that had broken the backs of 3 generations of men in Smith County, Texas. Something hollow. Earl Denton wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of a hand so cracked and calloused it looked like an aerial map of the very land he stood on. It was the 3rd week of July, 1973. The thermometer outside the Hereford Co-op had read 103 degrees at 9 in the morning, and out here in the open field with nothing between a man and the sun but a straw hat and stubbornness, it felt closer to 115. He was standing 6 feet deep in a hole that everyone in Smith County had told him was a fool's grave. And when he looked down at what his shovel had struck, when he truly saw it, Earl Denton sat down in the dirt, put his face in his hands, and wept. Not from sadness. From the sudden, staggering weight of being right. Let me tell you about the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1973. If you've never been to Smith County, picture this. The land is so flat that on a clear day you can see weather coming from 40 miles away. The sky doesn't sit above you there, it surrounds you, a dome of bleached-out blue that bends all the way to the horizon in every direction. The wind moves through the short grass in long, slow waves that make the earth look like it's breathing. And in July, that wind is a dry, pitiless thing. It pulls the moisture from your lips before you even know it was there. The town of Hereford, Texas, county seat of Smith County, had built its identity on 2 things: cattle and sugar beets. They called it the town without a toothache in the old promotional pamphlets because the water had natural fluoride long before anyone knew what fluoride was. But by 1973, Hereford was also a farming community on edge. The OPEC oil embargo was still months away, but fuel prices had been climbing all year. The cost of running irrigation pumps that drew from the Great Ogallala Aquifer, the underground ocean that made this desert bloom, was eating into margins that were already razor thin. Commodity prices were volatile. The big operations were getting bigger, buying out the small ones. The Panhandle was changing. And in the middle of all that change, on 640 acres of 3rd-generation family land 9 miles southwest of Hereford on Farm-to-Market Road 1714, Earl Denton was digging a hole. Not with a backhoe, not with a rented ditch witch. With his shovel. With his hands. Following a hand-drawn map his dead father had left him. Earl Wayne Denton was 41 years old in 1973, and he looked 55. He was the kind of man who seemed to have been made from the same materials as the landscape, broad and weathered and quietly immovable. 5 feet 11 inches of rope muscle and sun-dried skin. He played football for Hereford High School's Whitefaces back in 1950, but you wouldn't have guessed it looking at him now. 2 decades of farming had compressed him, thickened his neck, bent his shoulders forward slightly, like a man perpetually leaning into a headwind. He'd inherited the Denton place from his father, Howard Denton, in 1961, 12 years before our story takes place. Howard had died of a stroke at the age of 67, sitting in a lawn chair under the one elm tree that somehow survived on the property, the Lubbock Avalanche Journal folded in his lap. He was found by Earl the next morning, peaceful as sleep, the paper still unread. What Howard had left, besides the land, a 1955 John Deere Model 60 row crop tractor and about $14,000 in debt, was a wooden cigar box. Inside that box were 3 things: a surveyor's compass, a folded piece of oilcloth, and a letter written in Howard Denton's careful, schoolboy cursive. Earl had read that letter 8 times in 12 years. He had it memorized. The farm itself was modest, even by 1973 standards. Earl raised grain sorghum on 400 acres and ran a small cow-calf operation on the rest. He had one hired hand, a young man named Tomas Reyes from the neighboring community of Friona, and a wife, Darlene, who kept the books and taught 3rd grade at the elementary school in town. They had 2 children, a daughter, Kathleen, at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and a son, Raymond, who was 15 and wanted nothing more in life than to get off the farm. They were not poor, but they were one bad year away from poor. The spring of 1973 had been one bad year. A late freeze in March had set the sorghum back 3 weeks, then a dry April and May had stunted what grew. Earl was looking at a crop yield projected at 60% of normal on a mortgage that assumed 100%. He'd already been to the First National Bank of Hereford twice that year. The 3rd conversation, he knew, would be the hard one. So Earl Denton did what men who have run out of options sometimes do. He went back to his father's letter. Now let me tell you about Dale Corbin. Dale Corbin was 44 years old in 1973, and he looked and acted like a man who had never in his life been surprised by anything unpleasant. He was the second-generation owner of Corbin Agricultural Supply, the largest farm equipment dealership in a four-county area, and he had parlayed that inheritance into real estate, a feedlot operation south of town, and a piece of 3 separate mineral leases out in the Permian Basin. Dale Corbin wore clean boots. This was something people in Hereford noticed and did not entirely trust. A man whose boots were always clean either didn't work or had people working for him, and either way, it said something about a man that couldn't quite be put into plain English. He drove a 1973 Ford F-250 Ranger XLT, candy apple red, which he'd special ordered, and he sat in the front pew of First Baptist Church every Sunday directly behind Mayor Harold Sims. He was the kind of man who laughed loudly at his own jokes and expected you to laugh too. He told you what things were worth. He told you what land was worth, what equipment was worth, what ideas were worth. And he had a particular talent, sharp as a new disc blade, for telling you when something was worthless. Dale Corbin had grown up 3 miles from the Denton place. He'd known Earl since they were boys. He'd watched Earl's father, Howard Denton, spend 30 years farming that same 640 acres and never get ahead. Howard Denton, in Dale Corbin's privately held opinion, was a man of limited vision. The son, he felt, had inherited the limitation. What Dale Corbin wanted, and had wanted for 4 years, was the Denton land. Not all of it, the north section. 230 acres along the FM road with good road frontage and a natural topography that would make irrigation infrastructure cheaper to run. He'd offered Earl $62 an acre for it in 1970. Earl had said no. He'd offered $68 in 1971. Earl had said no again. In the spring of 1973, with Earl's crops struggling and his bank account shrinking, Dale Corbin had quietly spoken to a man he knew at First National. He was prepared to be patient. And then Earl Denton started digging that hole. It started, as most things do in small towns, with a single conversation overheard in the wrong place. The wrong place in this case was the counter at Marta's Cafe on Burlington Avenue, where Earl Denton made the mistake of explaining to Tomas Reyes, over a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, exactly what he intended to do and why. By noon that same day, Hereford knew. The story that circulated, and stories always grow in the circulating, was that Earl Denton was going to dig up the north end of his property based on a map his dead daddy drew. Some versions said it was a treasure map. Some versions said Earl had told the banker he was going to find water, a new underground source, something separate from the Ogallala wells that everyone used based on his father's notes. Some versions had Earl claiming he'd find oil. Nobody agreed on what Earl was looking for. They agreed on one thing: it was crazy. The confrontation, the real, public, undeniable one, happened on a Friday evening in the parking lot of the Smith County Co-op, which in 1973 was still the gravitational center of the farming community. Men came there the way their grandfathers had come to the general store, to buy what they needed, yes, but also to stand in the dirt and talk, to compare notes, to feel less alone in a hard business. Earl had pulled up in his 1968 Ford F-100 primer gray where the paint had gone, a crack across the lower corner of the windshield that had been there since Nixon's first term, to pick up a 50-pound sack of seed treatment. He was climbing back into the truck when Dale Corbin's red F-250 swung into the lot with the particular confidence of a man who never had to park far from the door. Dale had 3 men with him: Bobby Hatch, who ran a section and a half north of town, Gene Pruitt, who was Corbin's feedlot manager, and a younger man nobody quite recognized, said to be a land appraiser from Amarillo. The appraiser detail would prove to be the most important part. Corbin hadn't come to the co-op for seed treatment. He'd come to find Earl. Earl, Corbin leaned against the bed of his own truck, thumbs in his belt. "I've been hearing some things." "Co-op's got good ears," Earl said. He kept his voice level. "They're saying you're going to dig up Howard's North 40 based on some map he left you." Corbin smiled, not warmly. "That true?" The 3 other men waited. A couple of farmers who'd been loading a flatbed nearby had slowed down without quite stopping. "It's true," Earl said. "Well," Corbin looked at his boots, still clean. "Earl, I'm going to ask you something, and I'm asking it as a man who has some respect for what your daddy built out there. I'm asking it serious." He paused. "Have you lost your mind?" There was laughter, not loud, but there. "Howard was a good man," Corbin continued, "but Howard never found water on that north section. 3 dry holes in 40 years. You know that, I know that, everybody in this parking lot knows that. He let that sit. Now you're going to take a shovel and dig where a dead man's map tells you, and you're going to find what exactly? Earl looked at him for a long moment. I'm going to find what my father said I'd find. Which is? That's between me and my father. Corbin nodded slowly. He looked at the appraiser from Amarillo. He looked back at Earl. You know what that land's worth to me if you find nothing, which you will. He named a number, $60 an acre, less than his 1970 offer. You're upside down on your note. You dig this hole, you come up empty, and First National is going to have some questions for you. And I'm going to be right there with $60 an acre, and you're going to take it. Earl picked up the sack of seed treatment. He put it in the truck bed. He got in the cab. He rolled down the window. Dales, he said, you might want to keep that Amarillo fella around a while. You're going to need a new appraisal. He put the truck in reverse. He drove home. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room or a parking lot where someone told you that what you knew to be true was impossible, where they used facts and numbers and the weight of other people's agreement to tell you that you were wrong, and you had to decide in that moment whether to trust the crowd or trust something quieter inside you? Earl Denton drove 9 miles home on FM 1714 with a cracked windshield and $60 an acre ringing in his ears. And he never hesitated, not once. To understand what Earl knew, you have to understand Howard Denton. Howard Denton was not a formally educated man. He'd finished the 8th grade at a one-room schoolhouse outside Bovina, Texas in 1914 and gone directly to work on his own father's farm. But Howard had a quality that sometimes replaces formal education in men of a certain type. He was a ferocious, lifelong noticer. He noticed things the way other men breathed constantly without deciding to. For 30 years, Howard Denton had watched the water behavior on his land with the patience of a man who understood that the land was always talking if you were quiet enough to hear it. He watched where the rain pooled after a heavy storm. He watched which low spots held moisture longest into a dry spell. He watched the vegetation, which patches of gamma grass stayed greener 2 weeks longer than the surrounding ground. He watched the behavior of the mesquite roots when he pulled them, noting which direction they grew and how deep. He kept notes. Not organized, scientific notes. Notes in the margins of almanacs, on the backs of seed catalogs, on loose paper stuffed into the cigar box. Notes that looked like the scribblings of an eccentric until you understood what system he was using. Howard Denton had developed, over 30 years of looking at his own land, a private theory. The theory was this: the north section of his property sat above a paleo channel. Now, a paleo channel, for those who have never encountered the term, is an ancient riverbed, an old watercourse that was buried thousands of years ago when the landscape above it changed. The Texas Panhandle is full of them, ghost rivers running beneath the Llano Estacado, remnants of a wetter Pleistocene world that existed when mammoths still walked the prairie. These paleo channels matter to farmers and hydrologists because they are often filled with sand and gravel, permeable material, and in a region where groundwater is everything, a paleo channel can act as a buried conduit, a highway for subsurface water movement. The Ogallala aquifer that everyone in the Panhandle drew from wasn't a single underground lake. It was a system, a vast, complex system of saturated sand and gravel layers at varying depths. And Howard Denton believed, based on 30 years of watching water behave strangely on his north section, that beneath his land that system had a branch, a secondary channel. One that sat shallower than the main aquifer, in a buried gravel lens that the county well drillers had missed because they'd been drilling in the wrong spots. The 3 dry holes everyone knew about, Howard had drilled those, not randomly. He'd been triangulating using what the hydrology textbooks call indirect surface indicators, trying to find the edges of the channel. He'd found the edges, he'd never drilled the center. The map in the cigar box wasn't a treasure map. It was the product of 30 years of empirical observation, recorded by a man without a college degree, using methods that would not have looked out of place in a university geology department. The letter explained the map, the letter explained the theory, and the letter ended with one sentence that Earl had carried in his chest for 12 years like a coal that wouldn't cool. I know it's there, son, I just ran out of time. Earl Denton was a farmer, not a geologist, but he was his father's son. He'd spent the winter of 1972 to 1973 doing something that nobody in Hereford knew about. He'd driven to the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas, twice. He'd written 3 letters, actual handwritten letters, to the Texas Water Development Board in Austin, asking questions about paleochannel mapping in Smith County. He'd gotten 2 responses back, both careful and bureaucratic, but one of them had included a photocopied section of a 1968 TWDB regional groundwater survey that showed right there, in the dry language of a government hydrological report, an anomalous gravel formation in the subsurface of the southern part of Smith County. The survey coordinates, when Earl plotted them against his county plat map, landed on the north section of the Denton farm. 27 feet from the spot Howard's map had marked with a small, careful. That's what Earl knew. That's what he was digging for. And he didn't tell a soul, not Dale Corbin, not the banker, not even Darlene, not fully, because he understood something his father had understood. Knowledge shared too early is knowledge diminished. You protect it until it becomes undeniable. You dig the hole first. Then you invite people to look in it. Earl started digging on a Monday. Not with anything dramatic. He staked out the spot 9 feet northeast of his father's X, adjusted for a calculation he'd made from the TWDB survey, and he started with a spade. Tomas Reyes offered to help. Earl told him to stay with the sorghum. This was something he needed to do with his own hands. The first 2 feet were topsoil and hardpan, heavy going. The July heat was a physical presence, a weight on the back of his neck. By 10 in the morning he was shirtless and soaked through, and the sun was a white hammer. He worked until noon, rested in the shade of the truck for 45 minutes, drank water from a canvas bag, and went back. By the end of Monday, he was 4 feet down. Tuesday morning, he hit the caliche, the calcium carbonate layer that underlies much of the panhandle soil, white and dense and resistant as old bone. This was the layer that had killed Howard's optimism more than once. Caliche doesn't respond to a spade. Earl had brought a steel breaker bar, a 6-foot length of solid steel rod, pointed at one end, and he worked the caliche for 3 hours, breaking it into chunks, shoveling the chunks out, breaking more. His hands bled through the calluses by afternoon. But at 4:30 on Tuesday afternoon, the bar punched through. Below the caliche, the soil changed. It went sandy, loose, permeable. Earl crouched in the hole. He was 5 feet, 3 inches down now, and scooped a handful of the material. It ran through his fingers like coarse salt. It was damp, not wet, not saturated, but damp in a way that soil at 5 feet in a panhandle July has no right to be. He looked at it in the flat afternoon light. He said to nobody, "Dad, I think you were right." He kept digging. The moment itself came at 6 feet and 4 inches. The shovel hit something with a sound that was not rock and not clay. A hollow, resonant thunk that traveled up through the wooden handle and into Earl's palms. He froze. He did not immediately dig further. He stood there for a full 30 seconds, breathing. Then he got down on his knees and began clearing the material away with his hands. What he found, 6 feet and 4 inches below the surface of the Denton North section, was the top of a saturated gravel lens, a buried river of water-bearing material that extended, as later surveys would determine, approximately 11 acres in width and an unknown length to the northwest, running parallel to and below the FM road. The gravel was coarse and rounded, river gravel, ancient river gravel, and it was absolutely saturated with groundwater. Clear water seeped up around Earl's bare hands as he pushed them into the gravel. Cold water, cold in a way that summer groundwater always is, drawing from a depth that the sun has never touched. Earl Denton sat down in the bottom of that hole, put his face in his hands, and wept. He sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he climbed out, drove to the house, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to a well drilling company in Amarillo, Stroud Brothers Drilling, who ran a failing 1500 rotary rig and had a reputation for honest work. He told them what he'd found and where. He told them he needed them out on Thursday morning. The second call was to Darlene. He told her to come out to the field when she got home from school. He told her to bring Raymond. The third call, and this is the one that mattered for our story, was to the Hereford Brand newspaper. He asked for the editor, a man named Cecil Watts, and he told Cecil that there was going to be something worth seeing on the Denton place Thursday morning and that he might want to send somebody out. He did not call Dale Corbin. He didn't have to. News in Hereford traveled at the speed of the party line, which in 1973 was still faster than most forms of communication. By Wednesday evening, half the county knew that Earl Denton had dug his hole and found something, and that a drilling rig was coming Thursday. The Stroud brothers' failing 1500 arrived at 7:15 Thursday morning, a substantial machine, diesel-powered, mounted on a white 4000 truck, capable of driving casing and pulling core samples in the same operation. The two brothers, Frank and Gene Stroud, were quiet, competent men in their 50s who had drilled in the Panhandle their entire adult lives. Frank Stroud looked at Earl's hole, looked at the material coming out of it, and said 4 words. "You've got something here." He said it quietly, the way men in that business say things they're certain of. By 9 o'clock, there were 11 vehicles parked along FM 1714. By 10 o'clock, there were 19. Dale Corbin arrived at 9:40 in the red F-250, and to his credit, or maybe because he was too proud to stay away, he got out of the truck and walked to the edge of the activity without a word. Bobby Hatch and Gene Prout were with him again. The Amarillo appraiser was not. Cecil Watts from the Hereford brand was there with a camera, a 35 Pentax Spitmatic, which he used to photograph the Stroud rig being positioned over Earl's hand-dug shaft. Raymond Denton, 15 years old and still not sure he wanted to be a farmer, stood next to his father. He would later say that he remembered the smell most clearly, the diesel exhaust from the failing 1500, the damp mineral smell rising from the hole his father had dug, the dry hot smell of the July air above. The rig went down. The Stroud brothers used a 4-inch diameter casing to protect the borehole, running it through Earl's hand-dug shaft and into the gravel lens below. It took 40 minutes to seat the casing properly. Then Frank Stroud lowered a submersible pump, a Goods 3887 centrifugal pump rated at 15 gallons per minute, into the casing, ran the discharge pipe to a portable tank, and connected the power. He looked at Earl. Earl nodded. Frank Stroud turned on the pump. For 7 seconds nothing came out but air and a little sediment. Then the water came. It came in a rush, clear and cold and absolutely real, filling the portable tank with a sound that everyone standing in that field on that July morning would remember for the rest of their lives. In the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1973, that sound was not just water. That sound was solvency. That sound was another year and then another year after that. That sound was the difference between a farm that survived and a farm that didn't. The measured flow rate recorded by Frank Stroud in his job log was 18.4 gallons per minute. For context, the average Ogallala well on a Panhandle farm at that time produced between 12 and 22 gallons per minute at depths of 150 to 300 feet. This water was coming from 60 feet. 60 feet on land where 3 dry holes drilled by Howard Denton had found nothing at depths of 120, 140, and 160 feet. Because Howard had been drilling in the right formation and the wrong spot. His son had found the spot. Let me pause here and ask you this. When was the last time the most important truth in a situation was hiding not in the obvious place, not where everyone was looking, but in a quiet, careful, patient observation that someone made over 30 years and wrote down in a cigar box? Nobody cheered. That's what Raymond Denton remembered years later when he told this story. He expected cheering. He was 15 and had grown up on Western movies, and he expected someone to throw a hat in the air. Nobody threw a hat. The water ran into the tank, and the people standing in the field along FM 1714 watched it, and nobody made a sound. It was the silence of people recalibrating. The silence of a crowd that had shared a certainty that Earl Denton was a fool digging a fool's hole and was now watching that certainty dissolve in 18.4 gallons per minute of cold, clear evidence. Cecil Watts took photographs. The shutter click was loud in the quiet. Earl stood at the edge of the tank with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, watching the water rise. His eyes were dry now. Whatever he'd needed to feel, he'd felt it alone in the hole, and that was enough. His face was the same weathered, compressed face it always was. If he was triumphant, he kept it inside, which was perhaps the most dignified thing about him. Darlene stood beside him. She held his hand. She didn't say anything either. Dale Corbin stood 20 feet away. If you want to understand what those moments do to a man of Dale Corbin's particular constitution, a man who derives his sense of authority from knowing what things are worth, from being the one in the room who is right, then imagine having that certainty taken from you not by argument, not by debate, but by water. By cold, running, undeniable water coming out of the ground on land you'd offered $60 an acre for 3 weeks ago. Bobby Hatch said quietly to nobody in particular, "Well, I'll be damned." Gene Pruitt said nothing. Dale Corbin looked at the tank, he looked at the rig. He looked at Earl's hand-dug hole, still open in the dirt, 6 feet and 4 inches deep with the water seeping along its base. He looked at Earl. Earl looked back. No words were exchanged. There were no words that fit. In the accounting of that moment, every syllable that Dale Corbin had spoken in the co-op parking lot was already on the ledger, already paid for, and adding more to the total wouldn't help. Corbin walked back to his truck. He got in, he drove away. Cecil Watts wrote in his notes, D. Corbin Department, approx. 10:47, no comment. The Hereford brand ran the story on its front page the following Thursday, July 26, 1973. The headline read, "Local farmers' discovery could signal new water formation in South County." There was a photograph of Earl standing next to the pump discharge pipe, water running over his hand. He was looking at the camera with an expression that, in the flat black and white of the newsprint, was impossible to read. Raymond kept a copy of that photograph for the rest of his life. The Texas Water Development Board sent a hydrogeologist named Dr. Patricia Chavez to the Denton farm in September of 1973. Dr. Chavez was 31 years old, a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, the daughter of a farmer from the Rio Grande Valley, and she was, by all accounts, the most competent person to set foot on the Denton property in its 3-generation history. She spent 4 days on the north section, taking core samples, analyzing the gravel lens, mapping its extent with a transit and a string of perforated pipe lowered into 4 additional test holes that Earl hand-dug while she directed. Her conclusion, filed with the TWDB in November 1973, was that the Denton property sat above a previously uncharted Paleochannel remnant, an ancient tributary of what had been a Pleistocene-era drainage system that contained a saturated gravel lens approximately 11 acres in width, of undetermined length, at a depth of 54 to 68 feet. The recharge characteristics of the lens were different from the main Ogallala Formation. It appeared to receive lateral recharge from a deeper connected formation to the northwest, giving it a slower depletion rate than typical panhandle wells. In plain language, it was not just a puddle, it was connected to something larger. The report was filed, the state noted it, and then, as government reports often do, it sat on a shelf. But on the Denton farm, the water changed everything. Earl drilled 2 additional production wells into the Paleochannel that fall, proper rotary-drilled wells, put down by the Stroud brothers, each producing between 15 and 20 gallons per minute. He used the water to bring the north section, those 230 acres that Dale Corbin had wanted, under full irrigation for the first time in the farm's history. In 1974, despite the oil embargo and the chaos it brought to fuel prices, the Denton farm had its best year in 3 generations. The fully irrigated north section produced grain sorghum at just over 5,000 pounds per acre. Earl paid off the first national note in October of 1974. He sent Cecil Watts a Christmas card. In 1975, Raymond Denton, who had been absolutely certain he wanted off the farm, enrolled in the agricultural program at Texas Tech. He came home for the summer of 1975 and spent it working the newly irrigated ground. Something had shifted in him. He later said it was the water, not the water itself, but what the water meant, what it said about patience, and about the value of knowledge that doesn't announce itself. Earl and Darlene Denton continued to farm the property through 1986 when Earl's health began to require a slower pace. They sold 200 acres of the dryland south section to a neighboring operation, but the north section, the Paleochannel land, the water land, they kept. Earl made Raymond promise. Dale Corbin's business interests in Smith County contracted over the following decade. The farm equipment dealership passed to his son in 1981. and the feedlot was sold in 1983 during the agricultural credit crisis that hurt large operations disproportionately. Corbin moved to Amarillo in 1985. He's not remembered as a villain in Hereford. People there are too pragmatic for that, too familiar with how easily a man's certainty can outrun his knowledge. He was simply a man who was wrong and who had the additional misfortune of being wrong publicly, in front of people with long memories. The Denton farm, as of the research for this video, is still in the family. Raymond Denton farmed it until 2009. His daughter, Earl, and Darlene's granddaughter, named Kathleen after her aunt, manages the operation now with her husband. They've updated the irrigation infrastructure to modern drip systems, far more efficient than the flood irrigation Earl used. But the original production well, the one Frank Stroud drilled in 1973, 27 feet from where Howard Denton put his X on a piece of oilcloth, that well is still on the property, still cased, still usable. They haven't needed to run it in years, but they keep it. Earl Denton passed away in March of 1991, at the age of 59, from complications following heart surgery. He had by that point been recognized by the deaf Smith County Farm Bureau for his contribution to groundwater mapping in the region. Howard's observations, combined with the TWDB survey data, had become part of a broader hydrogeological study of the Panhandle Paleochannel system. At his funeral, Frank Stroud, the driller, then in his 70s, came from Amarillo to be there. He sat in the back. After the service, he found Raymond and said, "Your grandfather marked the map. Your father read it. Don't ever lose that map." Raymond Denton, then in his mid-30s, didn't fully understand what Frank Stroud meant that day. He understood it 20 years later when his own daughter asked him why they kept an old, dry well on the north section that they'd never used. He told her, "Because your great-grandfather put his X there. And that means something, even if you never need to dig again." Let me tell you what I think this story is really about. It's not about water. Or rather, it's about water the way Moby Dick is about a whale. The water is real and the water matters, but the water is the vehicle for something else. Earl Denton dug that hole in the summer of 1973 in the face of community certainty that he was wrong. He did it not because he was reckless or foolish or desperate, though he was, in a quiet way, all three. He did it because he had inherited something more valuable than certainty. He had inherited careful observation, faithfully recorded and honestly examined. Howard Denton had no credentials. He had no university degree, no instruments, no institutional backing. What he had was 30 years of looking at the same piece of ground with patient, specific, undistracted attention. And he had the discipline to write down what he saw. That is an act of faith in the future. Every time Howard Denton made a note in the margin of his almanac, he was writing to someone he couldn't see yet, his son, or maybe his son's son, saying, "I see something here. I don't know if I'll live long enough to prove it, but I'm writing it down so that you will be able to." There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't fit on a balance sheet. It doesn't show up in an appraisal. It doesn't appear in the line of credit that a banker extends or withholds. It is the knowledge of the specific, this land, this water, this grass, this soil. It is the knowledge that accumulates only through the long and unremarkable act of paying attention, day after day, season after season, without expecting a reward in the near term. Dale Corbin knew what things were worth. He knew market prices and land prices and equipment prices and the going rate for credit in 1973. He was not a stupid man, but he had made the particular error of confusing the price of a thing with the value of a thing, and those are not the same. The price of the Denton North section in the summer of 1973 was $60 an acre. The value of it was 22 gallons a minute at 60 feet. The difference between those two numbers was a cigar box. Let me pause here one last time and ask you this. What are the things in your life that you are assigning price to when you should be assigning value? What observations are you failing to write down because the world is moving too fast and nobody seems to be watching? What map is sitting in a box somewhere in your family's history, in your own experience, in the slow accumulation of things you've noticed but never said, waiting for someone patient enough to follow it? The farmers of an earlier America knew something we are perhaps unlearning. They knew that the land spoke if you were quiet enough to hear it. They knew that the knowledge of a specific place, accumulated over generations, was not sentimental nonsense. It was capital, the most durable kind, the kind that couldn't be inflated or foreclosed upon or driven off in a clean-booted truck. Howard Denton ran out of time. Earl Denton ran out of everything else first: money, credit, options, the patience of bankers. But he never ran out of his father's map. And that map led him 6 feet down in the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1973 to cold water and to the particular, inexpressible feeling of being exactly where someone who loved you always believed you would one day stand. If you're the kind of person who's still watching at the 30-minute mark of a story about a farmer and a hole in the ground, then you already understand something about the value of patience. You already know what it means to stay the course when the crowd is walking away. Hold on to that. It'll come up again. The Ogallala Aquifer, the Texas Water Development Board, the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, and Paleochannel hydrology in the Texas Panhandle are real. Deaf Smith County, Hereford, Texas, FM 1714, and the agricultural conditions of 1973 are historically accurate. The failing 1500 drilling rig, Goods 3887 pump, and John Deere Model 60 tractor are real equipment from their respective eras. Earl Denton, Howard Denton, Dale Corbin, Tomas Reyes, Darlene Denton, Raymond Denton, the Stroud brothers, Cecil Watts, and Dr. Patricia Chavez are fictional characters created for dramatic storytelling purposes. All dialogue and personal events are dramatized. This story is an original work of narrative nonfiction in the tradition of American agricultural history. End card. If this story moved you, if you've ever bet on something nobody else believed in, drop a comment below. Tell us what your cigar box is. We read every one. Subscribe to The Forgotten Farmer. New stories every week. The land remembers, so do we.